Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA has a fantastic Facebook page where they post a lot of important and relevant information for animal studies scholars, such as calls for papers, information about recent publications, information about upcoming conferences. So if you're not following ASA on Facebook, you should be. ASA is also a membership organisation, so they're able to do their work for animal studies scholars because people are members. So if you want to support ASA, you should think about becoming a member. Membership is just 50 Australian dollars. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by the wonderful MC Pony. Have you been to her website? Have you been to her Facebook page? Have you listened to her looked her up on YouTube? MC Pony, otherwise known as Elizabeth Usher, whose website is Vegan Enthused, is a hip-hop artist who is very, very interested in animal rights, has a lot of compassion and interest in animal issues, and she combines her activism with her music. So check out MC Pony. Okay, well, let's get down to business. This week I'm coming to you from the lovely University of Sheffield. It's a bit of a gloomy day outside, but the sun does pop out every now and then, and it's not too cold. So this week, I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Professor Rosaleen Duffy. Did I do that okay?
You did, yes. Brilliant.
Rosaleen is from the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield, and today we're going to discuss her journal article, War by Conservation, which appeared in the journal Geoforumin in 2015. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
So, can you start by telling us why this article? What inspired it?
Well, actually, at the time, it sounded to me like conservation was going through a really key series of shifts. I'd previously been working on the neoliberalisation of nature and the way that conservation was becoming integrated with market logics, and was, being reconfigured in the service of capitalism. But I noticed with the sort of rises in elephant and rhino poaching from about kind of 2010, 2011. That actually there was this kind of new security discourse starting to creep in, a real sense of urgency that something needed to be done in order to stop the poaching and to save elephants and rhinos in particular. Tigers also came in a little bit, but it was mostly focused around elephants and rhinos in Africa. And as a result of that, several of the conservation meetings that I was at with different conservation NGOs where I was speaking also started to attract a different kind of audience. So there were people who were from the military or from the private security sector also attending. And it made me curious as to why. And then all of a sudden, after about 2013, 2014, there was this explosion of the idea that ivory trafficking was funding Al-Shabaab in particular, but also that ivory trafficking was funding conflicts across some of the most unstable areas of the world. And I thought, to me, it didn't quite ring true. It was quite a neat argument to make. It was something that seemed very easy to claim, but, did the evidence stack up? So that's really what inspired it, as I started to dig into it from a sort of politics perspective, and then very rapidly found out that actually the evidence base was very, very thin indeed, but that this had been taken up by some of the most powerful actors in the world as a key discourse for driving policy and for driving funding towards conservation. So in a sense, that's what inspired it.
It's a wonderful example of academics doing very careful research and theorisation and contributing to a real live policy debate. And so it's a wonderful article. But let's take a step back before we get to the punchline.
Okay.
For listeners who might not completely understand poaching or its different manifestations. Can you tell us what poaching is?
It's a very good question, actually, and I think in one of the frustrations I had and why I wrote the article was that there was a very singular idea of what poaching is and what drives it was starting to also gain traction, that poaching was a criminal activity, that poachers were greedy criminals, that they were involved in militias or terrorist networks, and that they had no concern for animals. And I think that that really did kind of produce a very flat and narrow understanding of what poaching is, why it happens, who engages in it. So there's a whole spectrum of what we might think of as poaching. So there might be people who are engaged in subsistence level poaching, for instance, of kind of small animals that actually there are very large numbers of those animals. They're not threatened by that kind of hunting. But it's referred to as poaching because it's been rendered illegal by the state. And one of the things that's often forgotten, I think, by the conservation movement is those laws were originally put in place by the colonial authorities and haven't been changed in the post-independence period. So for some communities, the laws governing wildlife are regarded as very unjust and also as alien impositions. And they kind of fail to take account the way some communities, particularly forest-dependent communities, use forests and care for forests in a very different kind of way. So there's that kind of poaching. There's also I'm not seeking to deny that there are networks involved in commercial scale poaching and that it may also be linked in with organised crime networks, or crime that is organised, I think, is more accurate than organised crime networks. Those kinds of poachers, the sort of commercial level where poaching is for high value items like rhino horn, like ivory, or tiger bone, and also now increasingly pangolins as the most trafficked animal in the world. That kind of poaching also exists. And there's also another kind of poaching, which again is often overlooked, and that's the very large-scale poaching that's undertaken by standing armies or as part of a regional war strategy. So if we look back to the 1980s, there's really well-documented cases of the South African Defence Force, for example, using large-scale ivory poaching in the southern African region to destabilise what were then the frontline states of Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Botswana. That also gets overlooked. And I think in the sort of, the sort of 2010, 2011, there was this kind of over-focus on the poacher as the greedy criminal involved in international criminal networks or terrorist organisations, forgetting that actually there's this very wide spectrum of poaching and there's this history behind wildlife laws which may be regarded as unjust by some communities.
Fascinating. So it's interesting because in your article, the NGOs don't come off looking kind of sparkling clean. They're not just self-sacrificing environmentalists. Perhaps the worst sin is the sin of not doing their due diligence in terms of thinking through the issues, but perhaps there are other things going on. Can you say something about the role NGOs play in promoting ideas about particular types of poaching and that kind of thing?
I think the world's biggest wildlife conservation NGOs, the sort of Wildlife Conservation Society, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Conservation International, and a whole raft of others, increasingly International Fund for Animal Welfare, is also heavily involved in this particular debate. They do really shape particularly the way the general public sees poaching and sees wildlife trafficking, but also the way key donors and policymakers see it. So they are the go-to organisations for information. Straight away, the UK government, US government and others will go to I4 or Wildlife Conservation Society for information, or they'll go to WWF for information. And some of the information is really good. I mean, I have to talk about Traffic International, for instance, produces massive amounts of information and reports on trafficking of wildlife across the world. That's all very credible, well-researched, thoroughly thought-out material. And I use their work quite a lot. So, I don't want to give the impression that conservation NGOs are this monolithic kind of set of organisations that all sing from the same kind of hymn sheet. And also one of the other things that perhaps doesn't come out in the paper but is important is that within those organisations that push a particular line about poaching, like Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society, but also Worldwide Fund for Nature, is that within those organisations there are different views, very different views. And actually through the sort of research that I've done since writing that paper and on the current project, it's very clear that there are people within those organisations who feel very frustrated that their viewpoints are not being listened to, and that because security is such an important vehicle for obtaining funding in a highly competitive environment for conservation, it's very difficult for those critical voices within the organisation to be heard. So yes, you're right, they don't come off as sparkling clean, but I think, there are nuances there that perhaps don't come out in this particular paper.
Yes, no doubt. So can you tell us then, what is the link between terrorism and poaching?
Right, it's a good question, and my first and very clear answer is none. There is no evidence really that Al-Shabaab engages in any kind of large-scale ivory poaching or trafficking to fund its operations. If we were worried about how the wildlife trade might fund Al-Shabaab, then we would look at the charcoal trade, because there's very credible evidence that they tax the charcoal trade as a significant funding strategy. There are also ongoing claims that Janjaweed, Boko Haram, and Lord's Resistance Army, whether you would classify them as terrorist organisations or not, or as militias or rebels, armed groups, is probably the least kind of explosive way of describing them, as sort of non-state armed groups. There are ongoing sort of claims from conservation organisations and from donors and from governments around the world that they also use ivory poaching in particular to fund their operations. But again, there's very, very little evidence for that. And there are really serious concerns about the claims made that Boko Haram use ivory poaching as part of their funding strategy. Because a bit as with the Al-Shabaab claims, what that does is it produces a policy response that on the one hand actually doesn't tackle who or what is really driving poaching of elephants, because it focuses on Boko Haram, who aren't really involved. And then it also means that the strategies designed to deal with Boko Haram are also misplaced, because they are also based on the idea that Boko Haram traffics ivory or poaches ivory as a funding strategy. So it's a kind of a double problem in a sense, is that once you identify ivory or wildlife trafficking as a source of terrorist financing, it produces bad policies for both conservation and for anti-terrorism.
So we've got a few of the pieces of the puzzle in place. I think the one that's missing then is an understanding of why it's appealing to anyone to claim that there is this link between poaching and terrorism. Can you tell us something about the political environment that's generated, the desire among some to perpetuate this view?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there are probably a series of factors. One of the most important is that being able to make the claim that wildlife trafficking and terrorism are linked provides conservation organisations in particular with access to the much larger level of funding available in the international system for security measures. So whereas conservation and biodiversity in particular may have been thought of as the kind of Cinderella of environmental issues compared with something like climate change, making the argument that biodiversity losses are a security issue does allow those organisations to tap into those much bigger sources of funding that are available. So I think that's one set of dynamics, and that's really appealing. And in other meetings, again, people from within these different conservation organisations have said that they've been directly told to talk up the security angle because it's good as a funding strategy. And the second set of concerns that I would have as well is that it's attractive for national governments. So it's attractive for the US government to be able to make these claims as well, because it allows for disbursement of funding for security-oriented policies and support for security-oriented initiatives, particularly in Africa, where there's less of an appetite in the US public for American intervention and boots on the ground. So it allows for a kind of a further prosecution of US interests in Africa without actually having to send troops. And equally for national governments for African governments, it can be a really attractive narrative as well, because it allows them to use arguments about poaching and arguments about saving elephants to enact stabilisation policies in areas of their country that are perhaps resistant to government control. So, I mean, Kenya is a good example of that at the moment, where the sort of arguments about ivory poaching and the need to tackle elephant poaching and save elephants also coincides with government interests of stabilising particular areas where they do have armed groups claiming that they want to threaten the state or overthrow the state.
That's quite a glum picture you paint. Has any parties been receptive to your research? Has it had some impact?
It has, actually. I mean, I think in general, it's been, what I'm saying is not that welcome. I think amongst some conservation organisations, there has been the kind of pushback of, well, you don't understand the really intense problems, the operational day-to-day problems on the ground. And my response to that is that, I think if we over-focus on the day-to-day operational moments, which I don't deny are very difficult for conservation professionals around the world, that they may be facing armed poaching groups. If we focus solely on that and not look at the bigger picture, then we're actually missing a trick, and we're missing ways of actually tackling poaching effectively and saving elephants in the longer term, or rhinos, or whichever species it is that they're talking about. So there's been that reaction. But actually what I've been quite surprised by is a sort of a different set of reactions from certainly from groups or individuals within the bigger conservation organisations who are actually very pleased that someone is out there saying it, and then they're able to point to it in their own internal debates. So for instance, our BIOSEC team have been asked specifically to come and present to different organisations about our research, because they're concerned about playing into a narrative that may end up being, publicly damaging if it's shown not to be the case. And actually, to be fair to the UK government, the civil service within DEFRA and DFID, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which are the three main departments that deal with sort of wildlife trade and are sort of organising the upcoming London conference on the wildlife trade, have been very careful not to make statements that the illegal wildlife trade, and particularly ivory, is used to fund terrorism. They have made the argument that it's a security issue, but it's been more around the kind of wildlife crime, organised crime argument, which I also think is problematic. But they've been very careful not to make statements, and don't make statements saying that ivory funds terrorism, and particularly that ivory funds Al-Shabaab. So I think it has had some impact. And then our work, or the work that I've done on this, has been very well received by organisations that are concerned to support Indigenous rights and forest people's rights. So Rainforest Foundation UK, for instance, or Survival International. So I've briefed both of them on the work that we've been doing.
How wonderful. So for people at home listening, thinking to themselves, look, I really, want to do something to the best of my ability to help protect animals or to minimise poaching, what are your suggestions? What can people do in, say, suburban Sydney?
Right, suburban Sydney. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think one of the first things we should do is question. So if a conservation organisation comes out with a statement, we do need to question it and think about it and say, actually, what political work is this argument doing. So just last week, we've had a perfect example of this, where there was a sort of big social media campaign around 97 elephants have been poached in Botswana, and it was retweeted. We had lots of GoFundMe and Just Giving pages. But actually, when you dug into it, the Botswana government made a statement about it, denying that the figures were correct. But when you dug into it, actually, a lot of it was actually about dynamics within the sort of ruling elites in Botswana, and a sort of a kind of tensions within different potential ruling parties, who the new president had come in and had apparently disarmed the anti-poaching units. Botswana has a very militarised conservation sector, had apparently disarmed the anti-poaching units, but actually what they'd done was just taken away the sort of military-grade weapons, so they still had semi-automatics. And there was a claim by a conservation organisation which was funded by outside philanthropic donors, Vulcan, the Vulcan Foundation, which is the monies from is one of the founders of Microsoft. That they had done an aerial survey and said 97 elephants had been poached, but actually these carcasses spread over, the elephants had died in mostly human-wildlife conflict rather than being poached. The reason they didn't have any tusks was because they'd already been removed by the Parks Department, which is what has to happen under Botswana law, and be taken to safe storage in the capital. People very quickly jumped on the bandwagon. Oh, the government has disarmed the anti-poaching units. Look what happens when you demilitarise conservation. It leads to large-scale poaching. It's going to lead to elephant extinction in Botswana. And actually, very little of that's the case. So I would say, question it. Don't necessarily not believe it. Of course, there are always good examples that we can point to. But question it and just be careful about what gets retweeted. And what you provide funding for. And think about it in your own context. So one of the arguments that I've made here in the UK is that, people who are very keen on sort of environmentalism and on wildlife in this country, if the government suddenly decided that people who might harm a badger or harm a hedgehog or any other kind of charismatic species that we have here in the UK, that they could be shot on sight, and that the government could enact a shoot-to-kill policy where people weren't actually convicted, or there wasn't very often very credible evidence that they were involved in killing those animals. Would they accept it? And of course, mostly the answer would be no. So I think we really need to think about, if we're really interested in environmentalism, we really need to think about whether there's a kind of an unconscious bias there, or an underlying embedded racism, that black lives in sub-Saharan Africa don't matter, and they don't matter as much as the animals. And actually, I think we need to think about it differently and think about it all together. And that was one of my concerns, and again, one of the reasons for writing the paper. Was that this new security narrative and the jump to militarisation was undoing decades of really good work of trying to think about wildlife and people together in a much more cooperative way. And what we have now, I think, is, in some places anyway, a kind of a return to a very stark separation of humans and wildlife, and an assumption that humans are the enemy. And for me, in the longer term, that actually means it's going to be very difficult to have alternative kinds of more positive conservation strategies in the future.
Fascinating. Wow. Now, I ask everyone who comes on the show to answer 5 quick questions.
Right.
Are you ready for your 5 quick
I'll
questions?
be as quick as I can. Yeah.
Now, in some cases, you perhaps you don't identify as an animal studies scholar first and foremost, maybe more environmental politics. Is that right? Or a bit of a mix?
Political ecology, I think, is probably the best badge for me.
If you want to kind of answer the questions more in that mode, that's absolutely fine. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Oh, my goodness. I think it was probably Peter Singer's Animal Rights probably much like everybody else.
Animal liberation.
Animal liberation.
Yes, yeah. Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
No, I'm not sure that I have. I suppose the theme all the way through is that people and animals need to be thought of together. So if that's the case, then it would be 1997, the first thing that I published.
Right.
I guess.
And what was that?
That was about super parks, which later became called transfrontier conservation areas.
Wonderful.
It was all about the politics of creating landscape scale conservation between 3 countries.
Right. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar, or perhaps someone who's doing eco-environmental kind of work, who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, who would have a big impact on me? Bill Adams, who's a geographer at Cambridge, who has written extensively on the politics of conservation, and I think his work was he was kind of a key gateway author for me as I started to work on more kind of critical conservation studies.
Fantastic. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Gosh, these are very difficult questions. I think, keep writing and thinking about it, and keep the idea of animal studies and an animal focus there in the debates and in our thinking, because again, like many other groups, they can be very easily invisibilised or rendered invisible in our discussions. And I do sometimes get frustrated when I'm at conferences and there's this kind of assumption that only people matter, and people do matter, but so does the rest of an ecosystem.
Wonderful. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yes, I still use human, non-human, but I'm, I suppose, increasingly thinking that we should not be thinking of them in a separate way.
Wonderful. So what are you working on next?
At the moment, I run the BioSec project, which is a European Union funded 4-year project. We're halfway through, on sort of working out what it means to have a security-oriented form of conservation. And my part of that at the moment is that I'm writing a book about how biodiversity conservation and security became integrated, what kinds of implications that has for both the biodiversity sector and for the security sector. And within it, I'm covering the sort of the history of that, but then also the development of more kind of intelligence-led and surveillance, counterinsurgency type techniques within conservation, and how that may be used as a kind of way of trialling for warfare in the future. So it's not just about security entering conservation, it's about how conservation might get used for prosecution of future conflicts.
Interesting. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, we have a website, the BioSec website, which we regularly update with all our papers. We have a Twitter feed, which is @biosec_ERC, and our website is biosecproject.org. And on that, there's all the information about all the different people who work on the project. There are 7 of us all together, working on lots of different aspects of the illegal wildlife trade and security. So that's where people can find out the most up-to-date information on what we're doing.
Fantastic. Well, Rosaleen, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now you can follow us on Twitter as well at knowing_animals, or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.